Rain hammered the windshield like punishment. The wipers fought to keep up, but Miles Donovan could barely see the road. His eyes weren't on the highway, they were on the ghosts in his head. The screaming match with his wife, the look on his son's face the night he walked out, the sound of silence in a mansion so large that even his regrets echoed. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, as if holding tight could stop the memories from breaking him again. Lightning cracked open the sky, and for a second he saw his reflection in the glass. Tired eyes, unshaven face, a man who had everything but felt like nothing. He wasn't running from people. He was running from the noise, from the boardrooms, the headlines, the fake smiles, from the lies he told himself that money could fix the ache in his chest. Somewhere between that ache and the thunder, his car rolled to a stop before a sagging wooden shack. The place looked like it was losing a battle against time. The kind of house people forgot existed. But Miles stared at it like a drowning man spotting land. He didn't plan it. He just knew he couldn't drive anymore. By morning, he owned it. Cash, no questions. The realtor laughed, thinking the billionaire was buying a project. But Miles didn't want to fix it. He wanted it broken, like him. That night, the rain came again, soaking through the roof and tapping against the dusty floorboards. He sat alone in the corner, whiskey in hand, letting the storm outside match the one inside. For the first time in years, there were no assistants, no security, no one pretending to care. Just him, the rain, and the sound of something soft, a noise that didn't belong to the storm. He froze, a faint sob. Then another. Not his. He turned down the lamp and listened. It came from outside. Miles grabbed a flashlight, stepping out into the mud, his expensive shoes sinking deep into the cold earth. The beam cut through the darkness, and there she was, a young woman, barefoot, clothes soaked through, clutching two small children to her chest. Her hair was stuck to her face, her body trembling, but her back was straight. Her eyes met his, and for the first time that night, he didn't feel like the one in control. "What are you doing out here?" he shouted over the rain. Her voice shook, but her tone carried steel. "Just trying to stay dry, sir." "Come inside," he said quickly, guilt tugging at him. "I can help you," she hesitated, holding her children tighter. "We'll manage." He pulled a few bills from his pocket, his instinct as automatic as breathing. "Take this. Get a motel. Food." Her eyes flicked to the money, then back to him. "We don't need your pity," she said softly. And something about the way she said it, not loud, not angry, just proud, hit him like a slap. She turned, walking away into the shadows with her children pressed close. Miles stood there, rain dripping from his hair, the bills still clutched in his fist. He could have chased her. He could have insisted. But he didn't. He just stood there, watching until her figure disappeared into the trees. Inside, the shack felt emptier than before. The wind moaned through the cracks, whispering things he didn't want to hear. He poured another drink, but it didn't drown her voice. "We don't need your pity." He stared at the peeling walls, wondering when compassion had become a transaction for him. He'd built charities, funded hospitals, but never looked people in the eyes the way she had looked at him, like a man stripped of his excuses. Through the broken window, he saw a flicker of light from the small shed behind the shack. The same woman, Naomi, he'd later learn, had lit a candle. The twins huddled close to her, their faces glowing in the faint amber light. She smiled at them, whispering something he couldn't hear. They laughed, small and soft, as if joy were still possible in their world. He turned away, ashamed for watching, yet unable to stop. That night, the storm outside raged. But the real storm was inside him, the part that kept asking, "Why does she still smile?" The next morning, he found her again. She was hanging laundry on a rope, stretched between two dying trees. Her clothes were faded, her hands rough, but there was a quiet grace in the way she moved. The twins ran barefoot through puddles, giggling, their laughter carrying through the air. Miles stepped closer, feeling foolish. "You shouldn't stay here," he said. "It's dangerous. You could get sick. I can call someone, arrange a place." She looked at him, calm but firm. "We'll be fine." He wanted to argue, but her tone left no room. She turned back to her children, singing softly. Her voice wasn't perfect, but it carried peace, something his billions had never bought him. That night, as the rain returned, Miles lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Every drop that hit the wood sounded like a question. Who was this woman? Why did she seem freer in her struggle than he did in his wealth? He remembered his son's voice, the last words before the door slammed shut. "You don't know what love is, Dad." Now, in this lonely shack, watching a mother cradle her twins with empty hands but a full heart, he began to understand what his son meant. At dawn, he saw Naomi walking down the dirt road, her children asleep in her arms, heading to town. He didn't ask where. He didn't have the courage. He just watched her go. That evening, she returned, exhausted, her uniform stained with grease, carrying 2 small boxes wrapped in paper, leftovers from the diner where she worked. She knelt beside the fire and split the food between the children, giving herself only a bite. Miles turned away before she saw him watching. For the first time in years, his chest ached. Not from guilt, but from empathy. Something inside him was waking up, something raw and human. He'd built walls of glass and gold around himself. But in this forgotten corner of the world, a barefoot woman and her twins were quietly breaking them down. As thunder rolled again that night, Miles stood at the doorway, watching the shed glow faintly through the rain. He felt small, smaller than he had ever felt in his life. But he didn't turn away. He stayed there, soaked and silent, letting the storm wash over him, realizing the truth he'd tried so hard to ignore. He had come to this shack to escape his pain. Instead, he'd found it reflected back at him, in the eyes of a woman who refused to be broken. And as the lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the world in brief, beautiful chaos, Miles understood that something in his life had just shifted forever. He didn't know what it was yet, but he knew this: the storm wasn't there to punish him. It was there to change him. And somewhere between that thunder and her quiet defiance, the story truly began. Days passed like slow-moving clouds, heavy and gray. The shack sat in silence, the kind that made every creak of the floorboard sound like a confession. Miles stayed inside most days, curtains drawn, staring at the dusty floor as if it held answers. He told himself he needed peace. That was the lie he'd repeated since he'd bought this place. That isolation would fix him. But outside, life continued in a way that both humbled and haunted him. Naomi and her twins lived in the small shed behind his shack, a space barely large enough to fit a bed and a dream. Yet somehow she made it a home. He watched from the window, unseen, as she hung clothes to dry, humming softly. Her children, Micah and Lila, ran through the weeds, laughing, their feet bare, their joy pure and untamed. Miles didn't understand it. How could they laugh when they had so little? How could they smile when the world had been so cruel? Every sound of their laughter stabbed at his chest, a reminder of the son he hadn't seen in years, of the family he'd broken with his pride. The townspeople whispered. Word travels fast in small places. The story of the billionaire hiding in the woods spread like smoke. They called him strange, pitiful, and worse. The rich fool who lost his mind. Some said he was writing a book. Others said he was waiting to die. But when they saw Naomi, young, black, and strong, living beside him, the gossip turned sharper. People stared when she walked into town, their eyes full of assumptions. She felt it. Miles saw her shoulders stiffen under their gaze, but she never bowed her head. She kept walking, twins in tow, her dignity wrapped around her like armor. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the sky, Miles stepped outside for the first time in days. He found her kneeling by the fence, hammering a loose board back into place. Her hands were rough, her nails cracked, but her focus never wavered. He watched for a moment before speaking, his voice colder than he meant it to be. "Why don't you leave this place?" he asked. "You don't owe anyone anything. You deserve better than this. Anything. You deserve better than this." Naomi paused, setting down the hammer. She turned slowly, wiping sweat from her brow. "Because I don't run from life when it hurts," she said, her tone calm, almost gentle. "You heal by facing it." Miles felt something twist inside him. He wanted to reply, to argue, but no words came. Her eyes met his, not with anger, not with pity, but with truth. And in that silence, he realized how different they were. She had nothing but courage. He had everything but peace. From that day on, he saw her differently. He noticed how she smiled even when her hands bled, how she came home each night from the diner, exhausted but still humming lullabies to her twins, how she shared what little food she had with an old man down the road who owned even less. Miles had spent a lifetime buying loyalty, respect, affection. But Naomi lived them, quietly, without a price tag. Then came the day everything changed. A black truck rolled up the dirt road, tires crunching the gravel. The man who stepped out was the landlord, a big red-faced brute who smelled of smoke and cheap beer. He had sold Miles the shack, but not the land behind it. That, he claimed, still belonged to him. Naomi was squatting on his property. Miles watched from the porch, hidden behind the shadow of his door. The landlord's voice was cruel and loud. "Pack your things, girl," he barked. "You and your kids are trespassing. I don't want no charity cases messing up my land." Naomi stood her ground. Her hands shook, but her voice didn't. "We've nowhere else to go. Please, just a few more weeks." The man laughed. "Not my problem. Maybe that rich ghost in the shack will pay your way. Ain't that right, Mr. Donovan?" His voice boomed across the yard, mocking. Miles froze. His name hit like lightning. Naomi turned her head slightly, her eyes searching for him. Waiting. He could have stepped out. He could have said one word to end her humiliation. But fear, shame, pride, all the chains he thought he'd broken, tightened around him again. He stayed still, silent. The landlord kicked over a small bucket, scattering the twins' toys into the dirt. "Tomorrow morning," he shouted, "be gone, or I'll bring the sheriff." Then he spat on the ground and drove away. The sound of his engine faded, leaving only the cries of the children and the sound of Naomi's quiet breathing as she picked up each toy one by one. Miles stood there long after she disappeared into the shed. His chest burned, his hands trembled, but he didn't move. That night, he poured himself a drink and sat in darkness, listening to the rain hammering against the roof again. Through the window, he could see the flicker of candlelight from Naomi's shed. She was feeding her children, or pretending to, because the portions were small. He could see her silhouette leaning close, wiping their tears, whispering something to calm them. Her twins finally slept, their tiny bodies curled together under a torn blanket. Miles stared until his vision blurred. Guilt rose in his throat like fire. He'd built skyscrapers, foundations, hospitals, but right now, a mother and her children were suffering within reach of his voice, and he did nothing. He could hear the faint hum of Naomi's voice through the storm, singing softly to her twins, even as hunger hollowed her eyes. He set down his glass. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every thunderclap outside felt like judgment. For all his power, all his status, he was the weakest man in that rain-soaked yard. His silence, he realized, wasn't peace. It was cowardice wearing a fancy name. When dawn came, the world outside glistened under the fading rain. Naomi's shed was still standing, smoke rising weakly from its chimney. The twins played quietly in the mud, unaware of what tomorrow would bring. Miles stepped onto the porch, feeling the wet boards beneath his feet, the air heavy with regret. He wanted to call out, to say something, anything, but she didn't look up. Maybe she knew he had watched. Maybe she knew he had failed her. As he turned to go back inside, her voice carried faintly through the air. "You can't heal in hiding, Mr. Donovan," she said, not looking at him. "And you can't save anyone by staying silent." He froze. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even asking for help. She was just telling him the truth he'd spent his whole life avoiding. That night, when the storm came again, Miles didn't sleep. He sat by the window staring at the flickering light from Naomi's shed, realizing how small he'd become in the presence of real strength. He had once believed money made men powerful, but now he knew power was the ability to do what's right when no one else will. And as the rain whispered against the shack, Miles faced the truth that would haunt him till morning. Sometimes silence hurts louder than words ever could. The next morning, the world felt too quiet. The air was still, heavy, like something sacred had been taken from it. Miles woke to an emptiness he couldn't explain, until he looked outside and saw the shed door open, its inside bare. Naomi was gone. The twins were gone. Only the sound of the wind brushing through the trees remained. He stepped out, calling her name once, twice, his voice breaking the silence that used to comfort him. No answer, just the echo of his own regret. When he turned back toward the shack, he saw it. A small envelope pinned to the door. His name written across it in shaky, uneven letters. Miles tore it open with trembling hands. Inside was a folded piece of paper, soft from being held too long. It read only 3 words. "Thank you anyway." He felt the sting of those words deep in his chest. Not angry words, not bitter, just quiet resignation. The kind that said she'd waited for kindness that never came. He unfolded the paper again, and another sheet slipped out. A drawing, made in crayon. The kind only children make when they believe in happy endings. It showed a crooked little shack under a yellow sun. 3 stick figures, 2 small, 1 tall. Him, Naomi, and the twins. All smiling. Miles sat on the porch with the drawing in his hands, his throat tightening until it hurt to breathe. They had seen something in him he hadn't seen in himself. Goodness. And he'd failed them anyway. The shame was unbearable. For the first time in years, the billionaire who never cried buried his face in his hands and wept. Not for what he'd lost, but for who he had become. When the tears stopped, something inside him shifted. He couldn't sit still. He couldn't let her go like this, not with a "thank you anyway." He grabbed his truck keys, the engine roaring to life for the first time in months, and drove toward town like a man chasing redemption. He didn't know where to start. He stopped at the diner first, the little place by the crossroads where Naomi had worked the night shift. The manager, a gray-haired woman with tired eyes, looked up as Miles rushed in. "I'm looking for Naomi," he said breathlessly. "She works here. Young woman, 2 kids." The woman shook her head slowly. "Not anymore," she said. "Got let go last week. Too many late nights. Too many shifts missed. Single moms don't get much slack around here." Miles' hands tightened on the counter. "Do you know where she went?" "She said something about taking the bus," the woman replied. "Headed north, I think. New start." That was all he needed. Miles turned and ran back to his truck, heart pounding like it hadn't in years. Rain clouds were gathering again, dark and swollen. He drove fast, tires kicking up dirt, his mind replaying every moment he'd stood by and watched injustice win. Every second he'd wasted thinking silence was peace. Not today. Not again. By the time he reached the old bus station at the edge of town, the lot was nearly empty. A single bus sat idling, ready to leave. Through the fogged window he saw them, Naomi sitting in the back, her twins beside her, their small faces pressed to the glass. She looked tired but peaceful, resigned. Miles slammed the truck door and ran. "Wait!" he shouted, waving his arms, his voice hoarse. "Stop the bus!" The driver hesitated, looking through the side mirror, but Naomi had already noticed. Her eyes widened as she recognized him. The bus hissed as the brakes released. It began to move. "Mister, you can't—" The driver started, but Miles was already running alongside, pounding on the side of the bus with his fist. "Please," he yelled. "Just stop." The bus finally came to a halt. The door opened with a creak. Miles stumbled in, chest heaving, rain dripping from his hair. The passengers stared. The disheveled man in muddy shoes, breathless, desperate. Naomi rose slowly, From her seat, one arm around her twins, confusion and caution mixing in her gaze. "What are you doing here?" she asked softly. Miles swallowed hard. "I came to say I was wrong." His voice cracked. "I watched you suffer. I let that man treat you like nothing, and I did nothing. You didn't need my money. You needed my courage, and I didn't give it. You reminded me what strength really looks like, and I ran from it." Naomi said nothing at first. The twins looked up at him, wide-eyed, clutching her hands. The bus was silent except for the hum of the engine. Finally, she spoke. "Why now?" "Because I couldn't live with myself if I let you walk away thinking I didn't care," he said. "You made me see that money means nothing if it can't make you brave." He took a shaky breath. "You said you don't run from life when it hurts." "Well, I've been running my whole life. I'm done running." Her eyes softened. Not with forgiveness yet, but with something close. A long pause hung between them. Then a small voice broke it. Micah, the little boy, tugged at her sleeve and whispered, "Mommy, is he coming with us?" The words hit Miles like sunlight through a storm. He didn't know how to answer. He looked at Naomi, waiting for her to decide. For a moment the world held still. No rain, no noise, just breath. Naomi turned to her children, brushing Lila's hair back gently. Then she looked at Miles, eyes searching his face. "You don't have to come," she said quietly. "We're used to starting over." Miles nodded slowly. "Maybe I'm not coming to save you," he said. "Maybe I'm coming so you can save me." The corners of her mouth lifted. Not a smile, not yet, but a crack in the wall between them. She motioned to the driver. "It's okay," she said. "He can ride." Miles sat down beside them, heart still pounding. The bus started moving again, pulling away from the town, from his past, from the version of himself he never wanted to be again. For a long time, no one spoke. Naomi stared out the window, the twins leaning against her shoulders, their eyelids drooping. Miles looked at their faces, small, innocent, unbroken, and felt something inside him heal in the quiet. The rain outside softened into a drizzle. Miles reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the crayon drawing and holding it gently. "Your kids are artists," he said with a faint smile. Naomi glanced at the paper, her eyes widening. She exhaled slowly. "They really believed you'd be different," she whispered. Miles nodded. "I'm trying to be." Outside, the gray sky began to lighten. Miles rested his head against the glass, watching the world roll by. Fields, trees, roads he'd never noticed before. The kind of places money can't buy peace from. He didn't know where the bus was going, but for the first time in years, he didn't need to. Somewhere between the road and the rain, he realized something simple but life-changing. Redemption doesn't wait for the rich, the powerful, or the perfect. It comes for those humble enough to chase it. And as Naomi closed her eyes beside him, the twins asleep in her lap, Miles finally felt what he'd been searching for all along. Not escape, but grace. The bus rumbled for hours, cutting through gray miles of open road and memory. Miles watched the rain blur the landscape into streaks of silver, each drop a reminder of how far he'd fallen, and how far he was willing to go to make things right. Naomi sat quietly beside him, her children asleep in her arms. The exhaustion on her face wasn't just from travel. It was the exhaustion of someone who had fought too many battles alone. For the first time, Miles didn't try to fill the silence. He let it exist, honest, unpolished, real. He had spent years surrounded by noise, board meetings, investors, digital alerts, and empty compliments. But this silence felt alive. It wasn't absence. It was space, the kind that gives a broken soul room to breathe. The bus eventually stopped in a small, forgotten town where the air smelled of wet earth and old wood. Naomi gathered her things, waking the twins gently. Miles followed her off the bus, unsure if she wanted him to. "You can go back," she said softly, adjusting her bag over her shoulder. "You don't owe us anything." He shook his head. "Maybe I don't. But I owe myself something, a chance to make this mean something." Naomi hesitated. The wind brushed through her hair as she studied him. This man who had once stood for everything she distrusted: wealth, distance, and silence. Yet something in his eyes had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something raw, human. She sighed. "We're heading to the shelter on Maple Street. They said there might be rooms open. It's not much." "I'll come with you," he said quietly. Naomi didn't argue this time. They walked together, their shoes splashing through puddles, the twins trailing behind and holding hands. The town was quiet. Rows of faded houses, a diner that hadn't seen customers in days, a church whose bell had long gone silent, the kind of place where people carried their pain quietly because shouting didn't help. When they reached the shelter, a woman with gray braids and kind eyes greeted them at the door. "3 beds left," she said to Naomi, then looked at Miles. "You looking for work, sir?" Miles hesitated. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him like that, not with deference, but with equal footing. "Maybe I am," he replied softly. The woman smiled. "We can always use help in the kitchen." That night, while Naomi tucked her kids into their bunks, Miles found himself in the shelter kitchen, sleeves rolled up, scrubbing dishes. The clatter of plates, the smell of warm soup, the soft hum of tired voices. It grounded him in a way money never had. He looked around at the faces, men and women broken by life but not by spirit, and felt, for the first time, like he belonged somewhere without needing to prove it. When he finished, he stepped outside. The rain had stopped. The sky was deep violet, dotted with the faintest stars. Naomi was sitting on the steps, her arms wrapped around her knees. "You've done this before," she said without looking at him. "Washed dishes?" She smiled faintly. "Run from something." Miles exhaled, his breath visible in the cool night air. "All my life," he admitted. "I ran from poverty when I was young. Then I ran from people. Then from myself. Thought success meant safety. Turns out it just builds a bigger cage." Naomi turned toward him, eyes reflecting the faint light of the shelter window. "You can't undo what's been done," she said. "But you can build something new. The hard part is believing you deserve to." Her words lingered. For a long time they sat there in silence, 2 broken stories intersecting in the quiet. Then softly Naomi began to hum, a tune Miles didn't recognize, slow, sorrowful, but full of warmth. The twins must have heard it too, because one of them started humming along from inside. It was a small thing, but to Miles it felt like redemption singing through the night. Days passed. Miles worked in the kitchen every morning, learning how to earn his place without his name or money. He fixed shelves, carried groceries, read stories to the twins when Naomi was too tired. And each evening, when the sun fell behind the church steeple, he'd find Naomi outside, always in the same spot, on those same steps. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. But one night, as the twins slept inside, Naomi finally asked, "What are you going to do when you leave here?" Miles looked down, unsure. "I don't know," he said. "For once I'm not planning my way out. Maybe I'll stay. Maybe I'll build something that helps others stay too." Naomi studied him for a long moment. "You sound like a man who lost everything." "I did," he said quietly. "And I think that's the only reason I can finally see what's worth keeping." She smiled faintly, a real one this time. "Then maybe you didn't lose as much as you think." That night, Miles couldn't sleep. He walked through the shelter hallways, past the beds of people he'd once overlooked. Men like his father, women like Naomi, children who reminded him that humanity isn't measured by success, but by the moments we show up for each other. He stepped outside again, into the cold. The stars were brighter now. For the first time in years, he whispered a prayer. Not for wealth, not for forgiveness, but for courage to stay human. In the distance, a faint orange glow appeared over the horizon. Dawn, soft and uncertain. Naomi's voice echoed faintly from inside, calling her children awake. Miles smiled to himself, realizing that this quiet, imperfect life, was more honest than any empire he'd ever built. Because sometimes grace doesn't come roaring with trumpets or miracles. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a second chance. Wearing tired clothes, carrying 2 children, and humming softly beneath a shelter light.